And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's broadcast in Iraq. A new U.S. government report has found much of the U.S. taxpayer money used for Iraq's reconstruction has likely been squandered. In what has been called their final audit report, the Office of the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction Funds pinpointed a number of accounting weaknesses that, quote, put billions of American taxpayer dollars at risk of waste and misappropriation in the largest reconstruction project of its kind in U.S. history. The report concluded the precise amount lost to fraud and waste can never be known. While much of Iraq is still struggling to recover from the 2003 invasion and occupation, the country's oil sector is quickly expanding. In June, Iraq's crude production overtook Iran for the first time in more than 2 decades. Iraq produced just under 3 million barrels of oil a day during the month, second only to Saudi Arabia. The Bloomberg News Agency reports the rising rate of Iraqi oil production comes as foreign investors such as Exxon Mobil and BP are developing new fields and reworking older deposits. We're joined now by Greg Muttitt, author of the new book, Fuel on the Fire, Oil and Politics in Occupied Iraq. The book takes a close look at how energy interests played a crucial role in the U.S. invasion. Greg Muttitt is the former co-director of the British group Platform that exposed the environmental and human impacts of the oil industry. Greg Muttitt, welcome to Democracy Now!
It's great to be on the show. Thanks.
Talk about Fuel on the Fire. Your, almost 10-year investigation of the reasons behind the Iraq War.
Well, if we start with those 2 bits of news you mentioned, the US Special Inspector General's report finding enormous corruption and Iraqi oil production increasing and catching up with Iran, actually those 2 are connected. And what we've seen is since the multinationals have been in Iraq, which is about 2 years, corruption has blossomed in the oil sector. Far from bringing transparency and ethical way of doing business, as we were told, they have created the conditions for much greater corruption. Now, what I've done is since 2003, since the war began, I've closely followed what's happened in the oil sector. I've worked closely with Iraqi trade unions in particular and other civil society groups. And as you would imagine, the story that I tell in the book is rather different from the one the government wanted us to know about.
Well, you talk about the oil industry actually promoting the corruption. How does it?
What's happened is that since 2010, vast quantities of cash have been injected into Iraq by the likes of BP and Exxon Mobil in an almost complete absence of oversight by government agencies. There are 2 bribery investigations going on into Western oil companies operating in Iraq. One is against Eni, the Italian company. There's an investigation in Italy. Another is against Leighton Holdings, which is an Australian company building the oil export facilities in Basra. And I think an example of this is, an example of the problem is that BP, which won the first contract in Iraq in 2009, they subsequently renegotiated the contract after it was awarded, and they set a time limit on the Iraqi side's ability to approve or not approve subcontracts. When it came to awarding drilling contracts, $500 million worth of drilling contracts, they were overpriced. They awarded drilling contracts at $10 million, not $3 million, which is the normal going rate. And because they put into their contract a time limit on the Iraqi participants in the contract's ability to object, that time limit passed and these overpriced contracts were awarded. You look a bit more closely and you find that one of the contractors doing the drilling is a subsidiary of BP's partner in the field.
Well, let's go back to the beginning, right before the war, and look at the difference between the privatized oil fields today and the nationalized oil fields then. Greg Muttitt, then you were marching in one of the largest mass protests in British history against the war in Iraq. And talk about how you then decided to embark on this investigation.
Well, it was fairly obvious to me, as it was to many people at the time in 2003, that oil was fairly centrally involved here. in spite of the government's insistences that it wasn't thinking about oil at all. I mean, you only had to look at the fact that Iraq had about a tenth of the world's remaining oil reserves, and put together with its neighbours, the Persian Gulf region as a whole had nearly 2/3. Now, to suggest that the Bush administration didn't think about that, didn't notice, simply isn't credible. So I was involved in the protests against the war. I was furious about my government's decision to go to war, and I thought, let's see what happens next to the oil. Let's see how this plays out. So I followed it for, especially using industry sources and government sources. The plans were shared far more in London than they were in Basra or Baghdad at the time. And it was simply through asking the question, which I thought was a fairly obvious question, what's happening to the oil, that I got involved in it.
I mean, the signs were everywhere, blood for oil, blood for oil. So how did you get the information? How were you following the oil trail?
Well, it was different at different stages. During the first 18 months or so of the occupation, I was doing things like going to oil industry conferences in London. I was reading the magazines and journals that oil companies use. And through those, I was building up quite a clear picture of what they wanted from Iraq. I went to Iraq for the first time in 2005 and discovered that I had much better access to information being in London than my friends and colleagues in Basra and Baghdad did. So I started sharing the information with my Iraqi colleagues, especially in the oil workers' trade union. This went on for a few years. I went to several of the meetings between the Iraqi government and international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, or with the oil companies and so on. The big get-togethers of all the oil companies. I learned more through observing that. And then I got involved in the campaign to stop the privatization of Iraq's oil, which was, again, led by the trade unions. I was in a supportive role from Britain and providing information and also political solidarity. In 2009, I started work on my book. And I wanted to dig deeper while I was working on the book. So I interviewed senior officials of the US, British and Iraqi governments. And I also got hold of around 1,000 government documents from the British and American governments under the Freedom of Information Acts. And through all of this, I was able to tell the story of how the struggles over oil played out during the occupation.
We're going to break, then come back, and after we finish speaking with Greg Muttitt, author of Fuel on the Fire, Oil and Politics in Occupied Iraq, we're going back to the Green Convention. On Saturday, the new presidential and vice presidential candidates gave their acceptance addresses, and we'll hear from Gar Alperovitz, who gave a speech about third-party movements and worker collectives around the United States and the world. Stay with us.